In our last lectures, we've considered a whole series of regimes close to our own times, whose ideologies and whose atrocities in the name of their ideas have done much to shape the violent course of the 20th century. In today's lecture, however, we want to observe a remarkable transition, what many felt at the time was a turning point. As the 20th century neared its end, the spirit of the times seemed to be sending mixed signals. On the one hand, a message of hope. On the other hand, the suggestion that perhaps a whole new round of ideological conflict might yet emerge. From 1989 to 1991, truly remarkable years in modern historical experience, a whole series of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union itself fell apart with astonishing, unexpected speed. And in this context, hopes for a transition to democracy abounded in these newly liberated countries. Yet at precisely the same juncture, in the Balkans, Europe saw a reversion to crimes which many had hoped would not occur again, crimes which resembled those of the Second World War. As the formerly unified state of Yugoslavia began to come apart and crumble, new leaders emerged who proclaimed new nationalist ideologies with the aim of ethnic cleansing to produce states on the basis of national unification and identity. Radio, TV, and even pop music would be deployed to incite ethnic hatreds. In Bosnia and Kosovo, atrocities would be seen that reflected all too well experience of bygone generations. We want to consider in today's lecture, in other words, both the causes of these remarkable phenomena, as well as to consider the reasons for the belated intervention by the international community as things went wrong in the Balkans. We'll consider first the democratic wave, centered around the year 1989. Clearly, 1989 marked the end of an epoch. For most of the Cold War, it's estimated that about a third of the world's population had lived under communist regimes. In 1989 and the few years that followed, this state of affairs would be remarkably overturned. The self-liberation of societies in Eastern Europe and Russia thus made the century's close a hopeful time. But at the same time, there were certain events that suggested, even to contemporaries, that millenarian expectations of a democratic utopia just over the horizon were premature. Let's speak then first to the hopes of 1989. There were certain remarkable figures who had been active before this year who now would come into their own and be recognized as models for civic behavior. These remarkable individuals, and indeed there were many more of them than can be described in our lecture today, had in common the fact that they challenged authoritarian states, held up the standard of human rights, and their demands tended to converge around 1989. An event years previous had given many of these dissidents a foundation for argument: the signing in 1975 of the Helsinki Accords on Human Rights. These Helsinki Acts, which were treated by the Soviet Union essentially as a formality or a dead letter, would turn out to have remarkable significance because their rhetoric, their promises of human rights, would now be a commitment to which the dissidents would hold their governments. At the same time, in previous decades, a rich literature of dissidents had circulated underground, in a word, indeed, from Russian that entered into the English language and other languages, samizdat, meaning to publish yourself, which meant, in essence, the underground press. Novels, political works were circulated in the underground, in the samizdat form, including the works of Solzhenitsyn. There were other examples of such dissidents and writers in other Eastern European countries. A prominent example of one whose trajectory was remarkable and significant for our purposes was the Czechoslovakian playwright Václav Havel, who wrote absurdist, surrealist plays. Some have argued that only the form of surrealism could really be a realistic depiction of the sort of society in which he and others were living. This man later would become president of his country, but in this period was imprisoned for his human rights activism. He articulated ideas that others were also proposing at this time, ideas summed up in the phrase civil society. Civil society was the notion that there should exist a buffer zone between the isolated individual and the state. There should be a zone of protection between the great power of the government and the naked sole individual. Civil society, in other words, were all of those private, non-governmental relationships as well as ties that existed between people in families, in churches, in independent organizations. And this notion seemed especially attractive because it seemed to offer a prescription for recovery from totalitarianism of the sort that Hannah Arendt had analyzed. Another man whose role would be important, though a subtle one, in this period was the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, John Paul II. He was born Karl Wojtyla, and as a Pole was the first non-Italian pontiff since 1522. He had been shaped as a young man by his experience of a series of occupations of Poland, Nazi and then communist control. His championing of human rights with a religious message influenced the Eastern European transition in important ways. And yet, there still remains something about this remarkable set of democratic revolutions in 1989 that still evades the sort of close, quantifiable analysis that historians might like to achieve. I'd argue that one element, which is very difficult to even recover at this distance from those events, which played a crucial role in these transformations, were the anticipated futures of the actors, their perceptions of what lay beyond the horizon, what the future likely held. These changing perceptions of the future tended to give more confidence to dissidents, while they eroded the ideological confidence, once so strong, of the communist parties of the regime. In particular, there were concrete reasons for this. Economic failure, which was now undeniable, as well as political repression, eroded confidence in those earlier future visions presented by the communist regimes. And jokes indeed circulated in this period, which made clear that the sort of popular sense that this is where the future lay had seriously deteriorated. There was a joke, for instance, which asked, "Is communism truly a viable form of government?" And in this joke, the answer came, "Of course communism is a viable form of government. Because if this kind of mess existed under capitalism, it would have collapsed long ago." Another joke suggested that communism was like the horizon. It always receded into the future. This sort of bitter irony already testified to the sense of a loss of confidence in the future utopian visions being presented by a once vital ideology. In this context, the apparent economic progress of the United States or of Western Europe was a stark contrast to those who lived under other regimes. There's also another intangible element that around the 1980s was important but difficult to trace exactly. The movement taking place in the richer, more prosperous countries of Western Europe towards European unification also had a subtle effect on dissidents in Eastern Europe who felt that while this European unification was taking place in the West, they might be left out, that the doors in some sense might be closing on their European identity, part of a project that they wanted to share in. And this sense of there being no time to lose, I think demonstrably hurried along the events of the revolutions of 1989. Now further, technology could play an important role in hurrying along the revolutions of 1989 to 1991. We need here to note a recurring phenomenon that we've tried to emphasize in our lectures, and that's the ambiguous role of technology in the functioning of repressive regimes and in resistance to those regimes. On the one hand, technology could certainly enable for the government remarkably extensive surveillance, jamming of foreign radio or TV transmissions in order to keep its populations isolated. But then on the other hand, technology could also play a subversive role. Television and radio broadcasts, for instance, from the Radio Free Europe or Voice of America broadcasting systems, as well as, perhaps more insidiously and slowly, Western movies that were imported into the Soviet Union or communist societies, also could have the opposite effect of seeming to open the societies that were subject to their influences to the notion of broader horizons. One might add to the list of the role of technology the way in which fax machines would be used by opposition movements in order to keep communication with one another while these democratic revolutions were in process. Technology also played a very important role in creating a sense of crisis in the leadership elites of the Soviet Union in particular. The so-called SDI program, or Strategic Defense Initiative, often jokingly nicknamed Star Wars, a program of space defenses that had been proposed by the American President Ronald Reagan, raised the prospect of another unsustainable arms race that might be just around the corner. Debate still continues about whether this program would even have been technologically viable. But nonetheless, we have testimony of Soviet generals as well as politicians that the very prospect of a whole new round of escalating arms competition was one that many leaders felt was not sustainable. And yet, the hopes of 1989 and these democratic revolutions would issue in a remarkably peaceful revolt rather than elemental violent revolutions. This is an abiding mystery. Why were the revolutions of Central and Eastern Europe around 1989 to 1991 so remarkably peaceful when the potential for violence seemed so very, very high? It's a question we need to deal with. An important catalyst and model for change had come earlier in nonviolent resistance, in particular in Poland, which had a centuries-old tradition of social organization to resist foreign occupiers. In Poland, a true workers' trade union, known as Solidarity or Solidarność, in Gdansk in the 1970s had arisen, led by an electrician, not a committed ideological revolutionary, by the name of Lech Wałęsa. Even after this organization was banned in 1982, it continued as an open conspiracy, including about a quarter of the Polish population, a mobilization of civil society from below. At the same time, a sense of crisis was building in the Soviet Union, and I would argue it sapped the confidence of the leadership elites. There was a joke that was current during this period about the pass at which the Soviet Union had arrived. The Soviet Union was depicted in a once very formidable symbol of industrialization, the train. And this symbol of the train was deployed to show the way in which it had ground down and finally stalled out. The joke was that the Soviet Union's train had been hurtling towards the future, and then Stalin had taken over. Stalin had suspected that the engineer driving the train was a traitor, and he had him shot. Well, now the train completely ground to a halt. When Khrushchev took over, this joke continued, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's actions and rehabilitated the engineer. Well, the train wasn't moving forward any faster because the engineer was still dead. When Brezhnev, the geriatric leader of the Soviet Union, took over, he hit upon a new tactic, and that was to declare that the train was moving forward. He ordered the passengers to pull the shades down over the windows, and everyone had to sway from side to side and make noises of a train surging forward. The reality hadn't changed. Everyone knew it was a lie, but nonetheless, the system trundled forward for a while longer. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, the Soviet leadership, in this mood of crisis, of having arrived at a moment of decision, now gambled on reform. In 1985, the remarkably young Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev became the party's general secretary with a mission. He was charged with saving communism. Gorbachev had been born to a peasant family in southwestern Russia. He was a young man who had grown up within the Soviet Union. He had risen in the Komsomol youth organization and then in the party, and in 1985 was the Politburo's youngest member, even as he was placed in control. He now announced that his mission was to break with the totalitarianism. This was a tabooed word earlier. Now it was being used by the leader of the Soviet Union, to break with Stalin's abuses and to go back to a purer form of communism from Lenin's times. To this purpose, he deployed the perestroika movement, which meant restructuring, to seek reform in economics. In terms of social life, glasnost, or openness, was encouraged to promote constructive criticism. Gorbachev himself was probably surprised by the tidal wave of not only constructive, but also very radically critical expressions that now could be heard from society, and soon these programs were out of control. His reform programs were too radical for hardliners, yet too limited for Democrats who wanted to push forward. Gorbachev's reforms raised popular expectations and also disappointed them. In the West and in the United States, Gorbachev was often lionized, but often misunderstood as well in his real aims. Gorbachev sought to save the system. In particular, he sought to cut expensive subsidies to communist movements in other countries and to improve relations with the West by shedding the outer empire of satellite states. In East Germany, one of the most important satellites, after refugee outflows and conflict within the ruling elite itself, the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989, as ordinary Eastern Germans pounded it down. The scenes of celebration, those mind-boggling pictures of crowds of people celebrating on top of the wall or smashing away at it with sledgehammers, were broadcast worldwide and had a decisive impact on other political systems as well. In Eastern Europe, they set off chain reactions emulating those scenes of liberation, and German unification followed in 1990. Communist regimes elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe were also simultaneously liberalizing and abolishing the communist monopolies that had earlier been the rule. In Poland, in Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, new governments took power. In the case of Romania, its notorious dictator Nicolae Ceausescu met a violent end at the hands of some of his former allies who sought to hijack the democratic transition. This chain reaction, uncontrollable now, spread to the Soviet Union itself. In one after another of the national republics of the Soviet Union, liberation movements like Sąjūdis in Lithuania rallied their populations, even after violence by Soviet Special Forces troops in 1991 showed that Gorbachev was taking now a harder line. In August of 1991, Gorbachev's hardliner allies attempted a coup which failed and ultimately led to the Soviet Union's final breakup. The lack of confidence on the part of the hardliners was crucial in this context. One can recall the news reports of these days as the coup plotters who had Gorbachev under house arrest announced that they were now in control of the country. One of the coup plotters was obviously falling down drunk. The man who was reading the bulletin announcing the seizure of power was laughed at by the journalists who were covering it because very obviously as he was reading these comments, his hands were shaking. This didn't inspire confidence in the plotters themselves. It made clear that the determination to quell resistance, which might earlier have existed under a hardline regime, was lacking in this case. Such total collapse without conflagration of the Soviet Union was and still remains an astonishing feature. The opposition movements in Eastern Europe as well as Russia, which led to the revolutions of 1989, in spite of their high expectations, however, for fundamental change, were not utopian in nature. One might even argue that they were anti-utopian in the sense that what they were promising was not a resolution of all social problems, not a moving forward into a perfect society. Rather, their plaintive request was for the ability finally to live in a normal society, as they put it. At the same time, the process of getting out of the mindsets that had been cultivated by the ideological regimes that had ruled over these liberated countries was not quick and arguably still ongoing at this remove. The surveys of the damage done to Central and Eastern European societies in terms of economics, in terms of environmental damage, as well as in pure human terms, are still underway. Many bitter and keen Russian observers of their own society describe, sadly, what some of them call a century-long negative selection, in which those who showed most initiative, most creativity, most imagination, and most decency were mowed down again and again by despotic regimes. This very fact underlines a recurring and important point: the need in such societies to confront the past when that past has been brought to a close, because otherwise its ghosts will continue to haunt. History's blank spots, in other words, need to be filled in for these societies in an important psychological sense. The recovery of the past and an estimate, objectively, of what that past involved is crucial to a reckoning and a healthy beginning for such shaken societies. At the same time, even in such a hopeful mood, expectations were chastened. While the leaders of the movements in Eastern Europe were not utopians themselves, some observers, especially in the West, felt what was almost a utopian euphoria about the future of democracy. Some observers were led to believe that a democratic millennium had arrived. To give but one example, the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama speculated that we were living through the end of history. Not in the sense that the clocks would now end or events would stop taking place, but in the sense that the great debates over how to live politically had been resolved and that liberal democracy had won. In fact, as was being demonstrated even at that time, the democratic wave was not irresistible. Contemporary events were making clear that there were other alternative futures on offer as well. One case came in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. Chinese student demonstrations in favor of democratic reforms had gathered in Beijing, in the Tiananmen Square. But then, on June 4th, 1989, as a horrified world looked on, the Chinese army moved in and killed an estimated several hundred students while arresting 10,000 more. It was clear that this elite, the Chinese Communist Party, had not lacked the confidence to intervene. The agony of Yugoslavia in the Balkans and events in Bosnia and Kosovo would also make clear that democracy was not foreordained but could, in fact, be hijacked. The breakup of an earlier unified Yugoslavia, earlier held together by the charismatic communist leader Joseph Tito, who died in 1980, involved mass violence and genocide. And the international community's record was not a positive one on this score. Though the United Nations had prescribed the crime of genocide in 1948, the atrocities that were taking place, even at this time of democratic transition elsewhere, at first largely met with international inaction. The very notion of the international community could be used by some countries to evade a sense of their own responsibility. Yugoslavia, the so-called state of the South Slavs, had united disparate groups: Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, and Slovenes. These were groups that managed for a time to live together in relative harmony, and Bosnia's capital of Sarajevo, which we've already remarked upon as the starting place of the First World War, a historically resonant spot, for a time showcased peaceful coexistence in the mixing of populations of different ethnic groups and religions in the cafes of that once beautiful city. But with communist collapse in Europe, an ideological vacuum opened up, and it was ready to be exploited by cynical leaders, in particular by the Serbian communist leader Slobodan Milosevic, who exploited this situation, announcing a nationalist ideology of Greater Serbia. He would exploit pre-existing ethnic frictions in order to create the appearance of a spontaneous ethnic war to serve his ideological purposes. Milosevic himself was, in some sense, an outsider. He was born to a Montenegrin family in Serbia itself. He joined the Communist Party at the age of 18 and then rose swiftly, in the process very cynically betraying his own patron in the Communist Party, a man by the name of Stambolic, who now it's being suggested was killed by Milosevic later and whose body was recently found. In the year 1987, a crucial turning point in these events, Milosevic spoke to a crowd of Serbians at Kosovo's ancient battlefield. This was a prime example of the abuse of ancient history to mobilize present-day grievances, as he promised the Serbs that they would never be victims again. Other nationalities grew anxious at this sort of nationalist ambition, and in 1991, Slovenia and Croatia seceded from the earlier Yugoslavia and became independent after a brief war. In this new aggressively nationalistic climate, radio and TV were used by Milosevic to spread his message. The television stations broadcast historical messages calling the Muslim minority in Bosnia the Turks, using historical references to Ottoman oppression, pointing to the Second World War and its cruelties as a situation that might be just around the corner. At the same time, a popular genre of music, so-called turbo folk, which is a blend of folk music and electronic dance music, announced an aggressive nationalist message as well. We see in this use of technology and communications a remarkable phenomenon. We tend to hope that as communications spread around the world, that mutual understanding becomes more common. In this case, television, which some have considered to be more immune to the sort of manipulative message that the Nazis might have passed along with their radio stations before, was used to devastating effect. And one trembles at the notion of what the Nazis might have been able to achieve with this modern medium. Bosnia was the first to fall victim in the largest sense. When Bosnia tried to secede in 1992, Milosevic mobilized paramilitary groups to seize territory. Mortars and snipers targeted the once beautiful city of Sarajevo and besieged it. And practicing the big lie in their relationship with Western media, announced with remarkable cynicism that they were merely observing the city from the hills around Sarajevo, while those people within were bombarding themselves and killing their own people in an attempt to manipulate Western opinion. This was the big lie practiced to an enormous degree. Paramilitaries like Arkon's Tigers, private armies in essence, engaged in ethnic cleansing at Milosevic's direction. Ethnic cleansing, a term developed to describe this particular period in our own time, so the phenomenon had certainly existed over previous centuries, involved an almost sickening regularity of pattern. Terrorizing of civilians, men, women, and children. Raping of women in order to terrorize, and then killing to force mass expulsions. The stages of ethnic cleansing were systematized and became a horrifying routine. It's estimated that some 10 to 20,000 rapes took place. Not only the humiliation of those who were subjected to this mistreatment was involved, however, but also a symbolic attempt to destroy the culture of the Bosnian Muslims, which also became clear in the dynamiting of mosques and other cultural monuments. In concentration camps, such as those at Marska, non-Serbs were abused, tortured, and killed. When Srebrenica, a town that had been declared a United Nations safe area, was overrun by Serbian forces in July of 1995, Muslim men and boys were separated from their families under the very eyes of UN peacekeepers, and some 7,000 of them were killed and thrown into mass graves. International inaction, however, followed. The international community found it easy to fall back on the notion of age-old hatreds in the Balkans. The notion that those people had always been killing one another, and what could one do? There was very nearly, in this sort of ethnic stereotyping, an element of racism involved. The notion that, unlike the civilized West, such people were simply, it was to be expected of them that this sort of behavior would be common. European diplomats declared that this was a European problem, but did not intervene. And then in a brutal cycle, ethnic Serbs who lived as minorities in other areas were likewise driven out from those territories where Milosevic was not in control. At long last, out of shame perhaps at this constant television reporting of scenes that seemed to be from documentaries of the Second World War, the international community at last did intervene. NATO air war against Serb forces in August of 1995 helped end the war, leading to the Dayton negotiations in November, with de facto partition of Bosnia, no return for refugees, essentially a ratification of ethnic cleansing. In those 4 years of fighting, some 200,000 were killed and 2 million were left homeless. And then these scenes repeated themselves once again, close to the end of the 20th century in Kosovo. Milosevic now turned his energies to this region. Brutal repression of the majority ethnic Albanians in Serbia's Kosovo province led to an Albanian guerrilla movement. In the summer of 1998, Serbian police actions of increasing ferocity took place and culminated in a mass killing in Račak in January of 1999. As NATO forces, now without UN approval, began bombing the Yugoslav army in March of 1999, Milosevic sped up an ethnic cleansing, which was presented as being in response to the NATO bombing, but actually clearly, as a massive logistical operation had been planned before, Operation Horseshoe was put into effect. And now television once again showed scenes of rail cars of Albanians being expelled. Nearly 1 million Kosovar refugees were forced from their homes. But after long bombing in June 3rd of 1999, Yugoslavia at long last surrendered, losing control of Kosovo. After losing presidential elections in the year 2000, in part because of the disastrous series of defeats that Milosevic's ideology had led Serbia to, Milosevic was then handed over by Serbia to The Hague to stand trial for war crimes. I want to close with an observation on the way in which the past does affect the future and yields a legacy. A crucial point now comes into focus. The past, those archetypal and stereotypical ancient hatreds, do not in fact always dictate present or future actions. But the past can and often is manipulated for visions of a desired future by cynical politicians like Milosevic. It's precisely this that makes knowledge of the past and a critical perspective on the past so very important to our present day. In our next lecture, we'll consider yet another case of genocide that the world wished to keep at a distance and to ignore, but that nonetheless, of necessity, pressed its image upon the world's attention.